Betty Flores, once a promising Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu prodigy, now stood at a crossroads in life. She had once been the youngest black belt under Master Ricardo Silva, quickly making a name for herself in the world of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. In her early career, Betty achieved extraordinary success, winning multiple tournaments and earning the respect of her coach, Ricardo Silva. Every competition felt like another step toward fulfilling her dream, not only of becoming a champion in Jiu-Jitsu, but of doing something meaningful for her family and her community. But as time passed, life had a way of changing everything. Betty found herself pregnant, and her partner abandoned her. This marked a turning point in her life. The world of Jiu-Jitsu, where she had been a rising star, suddenly became distant. She chose to focus on motherhood and survival, leaving behind the life she had once imagined. Her dream of becoming a Jiu-Jitsu legend was buried beneath the reality of single motherhood. Betty became a clerk at an office, a job that paid the bills but left her feeling unfulfilled. The gym, the tournaments, and the energy of the mat all faded into the background as she focused on raising her daughter, Luna, and dealing with the daily grind of life. She was no longer the champion in the ring, but rather a woman juggling the responsibilities of life, trying to make ends meet. However, tonight was different. Sitting beside Luna, Betty felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. As they sat together, Luna reached into a dusty box and pulled out an old, tarnished medal. "Mama, what's this? Were you like a superhero or something?" Luna asked. Her wide eyes filled with curiosity. Betty froze. The question hit harder than she expected. The medal, now worn and faded with time, was a reminder of who she used to be. It was a piece of her past, a piece she had buried. The black belt, once a symbol of strength and discipline, now seemed like a relic of a life she had left behind. But as memories of training, competitions, and her mentor's voice filled her mind, Betty realized something crucial. She hadn't truly given up. She had just buried that part of herself. As Luna fell asleep, Betty sat alone on the couch, the medal still in her hand. Her fingers brushed over it, and in that moment, something inside her stirred. A spark of determination flickered in her chest. She wouldn't let Luna grow up thinking her mother had surrendered. She had to reclaim her fire, not just for herself, but for Luna. The next day, she picked up her old phone and dialed Ricardo's number. She was ready to come back, not for glory, but for herself, and for Luna. Ricardo's voice crackled through. The phone, warm despite the late hour. "It's been too long, Campia," he said. "I'm not that champion anymore," Betty replied, her voice low. "But I want to come back. For my daughter. For me." Ricardo chuckled softly. "The mats don't forget their own," he said. "Start fresh. White belt. No ego. Learn who you are now." The next evening, Betty stood outside Phoenix Grappling Academy, a modern gym in Logan Square. The neon lights buzzed above her, and the music from inside pulsed through the walls. She adjusted the borrowed white GI she wore, a stark contrast to the black belt she had once proudly worn. Her sneakers were worn, and she felt every one of her 28 years as she stared at the door. The gym was filled with younger fighters, full of ego and ambition. Betty felt ancient by comparison, her heart thudding in her chest. But as she adjusted her GI and walked inside, she reminded herself that she wasn't here to prove anything to anyone but herself. She stepped onto the mat, feeling the familiar pulse of competition in the air. It was different now, though. She wasn't the young prodigy anymore. She was a woman who had lived life's hardships. She was a mother who had been knocked down but had not yet been broken. The first voices she heard were mocking. "Yo, single mom, you sure this isn't a yoga class?" A tall man with a purple belt sneered, his friends snickering behind him. Betty clenched her jaw but didn't respond. She had heard worse in her life. The taunts didn't reach her anymore. The man, Dylan, continued his jeers. "Coach, you letting just anybody in now?" His friends laughed again, their eyes glinting with amusement. But Betty remained calm. She didn't rise to the bait. Her posture was steady, and her focus was clear. The taunts didn't break her resolve. They didn't even shake her. Dylan's words were nothing compared to the weight of the world she had already carried. She was here for a reason, and nothing would stop her from reclaiming the fire she had buried so long ago. The warm-up began, and Betty moved with a quiet precision. Her body remembered the movements, each step, each shift of her weight, every technique. It was like waking up a muscle memory that had been dormant for far too long. As the class began to pair up, Dylan continued to sneer. But Betty kept her focus, not on him, but on the movements that came so naturally to her. As the class lined up to bow in, Betty stood at the back, her eyes fixed on the mat. She wasn't here to prove Dylan wrong. Not yet. She was here for herself, for the woman she had been, and for the woman she was still capable of becoming. The spark in her chest flared brighter with every movement, and when the coach called, "Let's roll," Betty Flores stepped back into the fire. The next day, Betty stood outside Phoenix Grappling Academy, her heart pounding in her chest. The gym was a sleek, modern facility nestled in Logan Square, with neon lights buzzing in the windows and music thumping from the walls. She adjusted her worn sneakers and looked down at the borrowed white GI she wore, feeling its stiffness against her skin. It was a far cry from the black belt she had once proudly worn, but Betty wasn't here for recognition or praise. She was here for herself. She was here to reclaim a part of her that had been buried too long. Her reflection in the glass door seemed like a stranger. She had aged since the last time she stepped onto the mats, but the fire inside her was still burning, faint but undeniable. She took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and walked inside. The gym was filled with fighters, young, confident, and eager to prove themselves. The atmosphere crackled with energy. Betty was just one in a sea of newcomers. As she stood by the door, a few heads turned, but most didn't take notice. She was just another woman in a white guy, hoping to find her way in a place that seemed full of seasoned warriors. The sound of bodies colliding on the mats, the grunts of effort, the slap of feet against the floor. Everything felt familiar, yet distant. She stood at the edge of the gym, stretching and trying to shake off the nerves. Her body moved with practiced precision. And even though she was years removed from competitive jiu-jitsu, her muscle memory never truly faded. It was as though the fire within her had merely been waiting for her to wake it up. As Betty stretched, Dylan, the same purple belt who had mocked her earlier, approached. He stood with his crew, his smirk as sharp as before. "Yo, single mom, sure this isn't a yoga class?" he sneered. The words were meant to degrade her, to make her feel small, but Betty didn't flinch. She was no stranger to mockery. She had lived through worse. From her office job, where her boss regularly made passive-aggressive remarks, to the people on the streets who judged her for being a single mother, Betty had heard it all. But here, on the mats, it was different. This was where she belonged. Dylan walked closer, continuing his taunts. "Hey, coach, letting anyone in now?" he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. His friends snickered behind him, their eyes glinting with amusement. But Betty's focus remained steady. She didn't engage. She didn't need to. Instead, she went through the warm-up exercises, each movement intentional and precise. She felt the familiarity of the techniques she had once mastered. The weight of the taunts faded as she moved, her body remembering each shift, each transition. "All right, let's pair up for rolling," Coach Marco called, his deep voice cutting through the noise of the gym. The energy shifted as fighters began to find their partners. Betty, still calm and composed, stepped onto the mat, feeling the sweat already beginning to bead on her forehead. Dylan, eager to prove himself and make a spectacle out of Betty, approached with a challenge. "Let me break in the new girl," he called out to the coach, his voice dripping with arrogance. Coach Marco glanced over at Betty, his eyes assessing her for a moment before nodding. Betty's heart thudded in her chest, but her mind was clear. She wasn't here to prove anything to Dylan. She wasn't here to show off or fight for attention. She was here to fight for something more important than pride, her own sense of self-worth. The match wasn't about Dylan or his friends. It was about her reclaiming her place in the world. As they squared off, Dylan's voice was loud and mocking. "Don't cry when I smash you," he sneered, trying to break her concentration. But Betty remained calm. She slapped hands with him and they began rolling. Dylan was fast and strong, his aggressive style fueled by his belief that he could easily overpower her. He lunged forward, trying to use his strength to take Betty down, but Betty's experience on the mats was undeniable. She sidestepped his moves with precision, using his aggression against him. She slipped into open guard, her legs wrapping around him in a tight control. The gym fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the slap of their bodies on the mat. Dylan's frustration grew as he tried to muscle his way through her defense. But Betty's technique was calm, almost elegant. She had seen this game before. She swept him effortlessly with a fluid motion, sending him crashing to the mat. The audience, which had been watching with amusement, went quiet. Dylan scrambled to get up, his face flushed with embarrassment. He shot Betty a glare, but she didn't react. She simply stood there waiting for the next round. Coach Marco, a broad-shouldered man with a brown belt, called for a reset. "Good work, Flores," he said, his tone neutral but approving. Dylan, on the other hand, was seething. He brushed off his GI and shot Betty a parting shot. "Lucky move," he muttered, clearly shaken by his defeat. Betty didn't let it bother her. She hadn't done this for Dylan. She had done it for herself, for her daughter, for the woman she had been, and for the woman she was still becoming. In the weeks that followed, Betty's confidence on the mats grew. Every day was an opportunity to push herself further, to remind herself of the fighter she had once been and the fighter she still was. The mockery from Dylan and his crew had been hard to ignore, but it didn't break her. Instead, it fueled her determination. Every session at Phoenix Grappling Academy was more than just a training session. It was a step toward reclaiming her place, not just on the mat but in her own life. Dylan's taunts had not gone unnoticed by the others in the gym, but instead of isolating Betty, they created an unlikely camaraderie. The women who trained at the gym, young mothers, college students, nurses, saw something in Betty they admired. Her calm under pressure, her strength despite her circumstances, and her refusal to back down from a challenge. They watched her closely, learning from her every move, and slowly but surely, Betty became a silent leader in the gym. It wasn't just Dylan's jeers that Betty had to contend with. The weight of her life outside the gym continued to press down on her. The bills piled up, the late-night shifts at the office took their toll, and Luna's asthma required constant attention and medication. There were days when Betty wondered if she was doing enough, not just as a fighter, but as a mother. Would Luna understand why her mother was always so exhausted? Would she remember the woman who had fought for her dreams, or the one who was always too tired to play? But every evening, after the gym, when she tucked Luna into bed, those questions faded away. Luna, with her wide-eyed wonder, was a constant reminder of why Betty was doing this. She wanted to be the example of resilience, of never giving up, even when life seemed too hard to handle. It was in those quiet moments, as she listened to Luna's soft breaths, that Betty found the strength to continue. At the gym, Betty's technique sharpened with every session. She began sparring with women who were faster and stronger, testing herself against their relentless attacks. One night, she faced a young woman from a rival gym who was known for her aggressive style. Betty wasn't intimidated. She had learned to read her opponent's movements, to wait for the right moment. But despite her experience, she lost, twice. The defeat stung, but Betty didn't let it discourage her. Instead, she studied her mistakes, analyzing what went wrong. She knew that in Jiu-Jitsu, as in life, defeat was not the end. It was an opportunity to learn and improve. Rachel, a fellow fighter who had become a close friend, saw the frustration on Betty's face. "You'll get her next time, Zumi," Rachel said, offering Betty a grin. But Betty didn't reply. Her mind was already turning over the techniques she needed to refine. There was no time to dwell on failure. Days turned into weeks, and the gym became more than just a place to train. It became a sanctuary, a place where Betty could leave the weight of the world behind and focus solely on the fight. Coach Marco, who had been observing her closely, began to offer more guidance. "You're thinking too much," he told her one evening, tossing Betty a towel after a particularly intense drill. "Trust your instincts. They'll get you where you need to go." Betty nodded, her thoughts swirling. It wasn't easy to trust herself, not after everything she had been through. But Marco's words resonated. She needed to stop overthinking every move, every decision, and let her body take over. Her instincts had never failed her before. One evening, as she was leaving the gym, Marco approached her again. This time, there was something different in his demeanor. "You've got something special, Flores," he said quietly. "Ever thought about coaching?" Betty was taken aback. Coaching? She had never considered it. The idea of teaching others, of passing on her knowledge, seemed like a far-off dream. But something about Marco's words struck a chord deep within her. Perhaps it was time to take on a new role, not just as a fighter, but as a mentor. The thought filled her with a sense of purpose. The next day, at the gym, the women's group, a mix of mothers, students, and workers, approached Betty with a request. "We want you to teach a self-defense class," Rachel said, her voice full of admiration. "You're not just good, you're us. You get it." The request left Betty speechless. She had never thought of herself as a teacher, but as she looked around at the women who had come to respect her, she realized that perhaps this was the next step in her journey. She wasn't just a fighter. She was a woman who had lived through the struggles they were now facing. She understood the importance of self-defense, of knowing how to stand up for yourself in a world that often knocked you down. "Okay," Betty said, her voice steady. "I'll think about it." Over the next few weeks, Betty worked with Rachel and the other women to put together a self-defense curriculum. The classes started small, but they quickly grew in popularity. The women, many of whom had never set foot in a gym before, were eager to learn. Betty found herself not just teaching them techniques, but also empowering them. Each move, each lesson was more than just about self-defense. It was about confidence, about finding strength in the face of adversity. But even as she poured herself into coaching, Betty's mind was always on the next challenge, the tournament. She had heard whispers of the upcoming Midwest Grappling Open, a regional event that would bring together some of the best fighters in the area. Part of her wanted to compete, to prove that she was more than just a coach. But another part of her, the part that feared failure, wanted to walk away from the idea altogether. As the tournament drew closer, Betty wrestled with her emotions. She had come so far, but the fear of not being enough, of not being able to compete at the level she once had, was hard to shake. One evening, as she sat with Luna after class, the little girl looked up at her and asked, "Mama, you're going to fight in the big contest, right?" Betty hesitated. "It's not that simple, Mija," she said softly. Luna didn't understand the complexities, but she knew one thing. You're the strongest. You can do anything. The words, innocent as they were, hit Betty like a lightning bolt. She couldn't let her daughter down, not now, not ever. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind was made up. She was going to enter the tournament, not for validation, but for herself, for the woman she had once been and the woman she was still becoming. The gym had called her back, and now it was time to answer. The day of the Midwest Grappling Open arrived. The gym, once a place where Betty felt like an outsider, now felt like home. It had become the stage where she had reclaimed herself, and it was here that she would prove that she was still the fighter she once was. The lakeside arena, where the tournament was held, buzzed with anticipation. The mats were pristine, surrounded by rows of spectators, and the air smelled of sweat, liniment, and raw ambition. Betty stood on the sidelines, her heart pounding in her chest. Her black GI was different now, a symbol not just of skill, but of resilience. It fit her perfectly, but it wasn't just the fabric she wore that made her feel strong. It was the journey she had taken to get here. In the black belt division, the competition was fierce. She was up against younger, faster opponents, many of whom had been competing for years. The first match was a blur of speed and aggression. Her opponent was quick and powerful, a young fighter who darted across the mat like a lightning bolt. Betty's defense was solid, but the opponent's aggression caught her off guard, and before she knew it, she was caught in a heel hook. The tap came quickly, and Betty was out of the first round. The sting of defeat hit her hard, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had prepared for this. The fear of losing had always been a part of her, but she wasn't about to let it control her. She wiped the sweat from her brow, took a deep breath, and reset her mind. One loss didn't define her. It was just a setback. She moved on to the next match, facing a fighter known for her wrestling background. This opponent had a low center of gravity, making it difficult for Betty to execute her sweeps. Every time Betty attempted to take her down, the wrestler countered, shutting down Betty's game. But Betty's experience, the years she spent mastering the art of jiu-jitsu, came through in the form of a tight de la Riva guard. It slowed the wrestler's forward momentum, buying Betty the time she needed to get back on track. The match went the distance, and it ended in a draw. It wasn't the victory Betty had hoped for, but it was progress. She was learning, adapting, and still in the fight. By the time the final match for the bronze medal arrived, Betty's body was aching. Her arms and legs felt heavy, but her mind was sharp. The tournament had been a true test of her physical and mental limits. She faced a veteran in the final match, a fighter who had been in the game for over a decade. This opponent was calm and calculating, a seasoned athlete who moved with the precision of a chess master. She was everything Betty had once been, the quiet storm that waited for the right moment to strike. Betty's first instinct was to go on the attack, but she knew she had to be patient. She couldn't afford to rush. This match was different from the others. It was a dance of technique, a test of who could maintain their composure under pressure. Betty's sweeps were tight and controlled, her movements fluid. She was no longer just trying to survive, she was playing her own game, and the veteran was beginning to feel it. The crowd leaned in as Betty caught her opponent in a lasso guard. The veteran attempted to counter, but Betty moved with such precision that she transitioned smoothly to a single-leg X guard. The move was risky, but it paid off. She swept the veteran onto her back, immediately moving into a rear naked choke. The veteran fought with everything she had, but Betty's grip was unyielding. The tap came, and the crowd erupted. Betty rose to her feet, her chest heaving with exhaustion. She had won the bronze medal. More than just a medal, it was a statement. It was a testament to her journey, her resilience, and her refusal to quit. The crowd cheered, but in that moment, all Betty could think about was Luna's bright smile and the little white belt she had given her earlier. This victory was for them both. As she walked off the mat, the weight of the tournament's pressure lifted. But the journey wasn't over. Betty had proven to herself what she was capable of, but she wasn't done yet. The gym at Phoenix Grappling Academy had become her home, and now she had a new purpose. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a teacher, a mentor, and a leader. The self-defense class she had started was now one of the gym's cornerstones, and Betty had become a beacon of strength and empowerment for the women who had once looked up to her as just another fighter. After the tournament, Coach Marco approached Betty with a smile. "You've earned this," he said, nodding toward her bronze medal. "But this isn't the end. You've got something special." "Ever thought about coaching full-time?" Betty thought for a moment. Her heart swelled with pride. She had found her new purpose, not in the medals or the victories, but in helping others find their own strength. "I'll think about it," she said with a smile, "but I'm not done fighting just yet." In the weeks that followed, Betty continued to coach the women's self-defense class, passing on the lessons she had learned on the mat. She was no longer just the single mother from the streets of Pilsen. She was Betty Flores, the woman who had fought to find herself again, the woman who had turned her failures into lessons and her setbacks into comebacks. One evening, as she packed up her bag after class, Luna darted across the gym to her, a huge smile on her face. She held up a drawing of Betty in a GI, a gold medal hanging around her neck. "You're my superhero, Mama," she said, her voice full of pride. Betty knelt down and hugged her daughter tightly. "I'm trying, mija," she said, her voice filled with emotion. She wasn't just fighting for medals or for herself anymore. She was fighting for her daughter, for their future, for their dreams, and for the belief that no matter how hard life got, they could always rise again. As they walked through the streets of Pilsen, the city's pulse matched Betty's own. The murals on the walls, the sounds of laughter from children playing in the streets, and the bright lights of the neighborhood, it was all a reminder of how far she had come. Betty Flores had found her place on the mats, but she had also found her place in the world. And as the Chicago night wrapped itself around them, Betty knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning.